would just get on with this. Hey, my friends, I'm Rick. You're not, right? Let's pop that up for a minute. This little Missy sitting here. She come up and say hi. She can feel I'm a little sad. Like I said, well, this will be my second attempt at this video. I'm not trying to drag it out, but one of the cats that we look after passed away overnight, and we've had to bury him, and it was kind of sudden, and we're a little bummed about it. It is what it is. Okay, so one of the subjects that comes up every now and then is when I was a kid, I used to have a pile of these old Reader Digests from the 30s and 40s, and all these great stories in them, but they were suited for an era that was well before my era, let alone the modern era. So you have to take into account, who wrote these novels and stories, short stories and crap, and when, and how things changed over time. And among them would be these stories about Native Americans and the frontier, the earliest days of America and days prior to America being America. Then one of those subjects that come up was just how large and how many and how varied the Native American tribes were at that point, and how much that they had dominated their local environment for many years, that we took and we dismiss it outright today as we don't even think about it. But in those stories and stuff coming out of the 30s and 40s, there was a lot of people thinking about it, and they talked about it a lot. One of the subjects that come up was the copper mines up and around the Great Lakes. Specifically, Michigan's the one, the best known for all these things. And right, meanwhile, you've got a whole slew of evidence for copper tool usage. And one of the important things that I came out of this years ago was that, first off, the copper, specifically the copper up in the Michigan area, is about as pure it can be without being smelted. And so, from my understanding, that means you can just find a piece of copper on the ground, say a rock the size of a quarter, and then use another rock to flatten it and smash it down, and it will become a thing. And just a matter of working it to turn it into whatever the thing it is you're trying to achieve with it. And this is important because there's no evidence that anybody's popped up, to my knowledge, of prehistoric or ancient copper mine smelting going on in North America, let alone up in the Great Lake areas. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever for that. It's just important because copper in a lot of other places in the world is tainted or needs to be smeltered so they can remove the impurities from it to isolate just the copper you want, or to help add other stuff to make other elements such as brass. But in America, so in this case, you would have had these people that was able to very easily obtain small numbers or small size nuggets of this ore, and then to fashion it into whatever they needed to do. In this case, tools for the most part, aws and needles and scrapers and knives and spearheads and arrowheads and so on and so forth. And one of the reasons that this developed early on, in part, was because this whole region, from my understanding, is rock poor. And what I mean by that is there's certain economic rocks, certain rocks that have more value than others because of what you can do with them. Obsidian, for example, comes to mind. So you can make glass tools. You can make rock tools from flint and slate because the way it separates, you can split it and it breaks into smaller, ever smaller pieces. So you can work those pieces to create spearheads and arrowheads and scrapers and crude knives and so on and so forth. Well, in an environment where that sort of stuff is rare or hard to obtain, having another replacement, in this case copper, was a natural thing. And so in my mind, I have to envision the what, why, and wherefore, the WTHF of things. I imagine at some point in antiquity, somebody's kid was sitting there at the communal fire or fucking around while daddy and mommy's working their ass off to get their, to get the daily grub scavenged up. And they just start wailing on this. They take a rock and they start wailing on this smaller rock. And then after a while, the one of the adults look over and make sure the kid's not trying to kill themselves or something stupid, and discover that this thin layered metal shiny thing that came out of the flattening from this big rock. Is at some point somebody trial and error or something. I just, in my mind, I could see that somebody's kid screwing around uncovers this extremely valuable idea, and then it just takes off from there. And of course, to make larger copper items, there's a limit. That's another thing that comes out of these mines, is that these are not mines in the strictest sense of what modern version of what we think a mine is. These people are obviously quarreling into the ground or digging anything cruder than handfuls of stuff with their hands and crude tools and wicker baskets. So they're not going to go on and take pickaxes and break up a big outcropping of something into smaller pieces. They don't have the technology or the knowledge of doing that. So they're looking for the smaller bits that they can work. And it takes another process. I believe it's annealing. I mean, quote me on that, but I believe it's annealing. And this is where you have to heat up the surface of both. So if I wanted to take two pieces of copper and turn them into one, you have to beat them together, but it takes heat to do this. You have to make them malleable, and then you're going to compress them together so they blend together and then become one item. And that takes another level of technology and a cum that there's no evidence, at least early on, that any of this took place. And later works, that's another animal. So we get this whole slew of these mines up here, and there's one speculative. The numbers are wildly variant. It's just like people's opinions. There's a whole bunch of people, or there's a number of people right now that are going after or blaming Graham. Graham, what the hell is his name? And I know it right off the top of my head. He's a big. They say he's not an archaeologist, but he's been big in archaeology, right? Graham Hancock. That's right, Graham Hancock, going off about evidence that the Minoans or some other biblical era or pre-biblical era seafaring tribe in Europe traveled to North America to mine all this copper and take it back to Europe, because there's a whole lot of people that believe that there's insufficient, for the sheer amount of copper that was used to fuel the Bronze Age, that there's insufficient copper mines in the Europe and access for Europe, so they must simply had to come from the Americas. My problems are, first off, why are we blaming Graham Hancock for this? Because this is not something that's new to him. It's been around. This theory been around a long time. And if it wasn't the Minoans, it was the Egyptians. And if it wasn't the Egyptians, perhaps the Atlanteans. See, there's something where if Graham Hancock has anything to say to this stuff, I think it'd be more along the lines of this, where he's implying that this pre-Andaluvian society, perhaps. So let's take that for just for a minute. We know for a fact the Younger Dryas occurred, that there was a number of very extreme radical changes in the environment in a very short window of period of time, and radical so that a huge amount of flooding took place. And there's speculation that this very flooding is also the stuff they attribute to the Noah's Ark story for the Old Testament, the Old Bible, because everything in the Bible, there's no hard set dates when it comes to the Bible. And I've read the story of Noah many, many times. I've had it read to me many times. I've had it interpreted to me several times. And there's a whole lot of videos or movies and TV shows that have dealt with this, right? At the end of the day, nobody can sit there and say what the actual era or year was. As opposed to say, well, if the Egyptian Bahuha had been mentioned at least one time in the Noah story, then we'd have a better idea of what era this great flood took place. Obviously, it had to take place before all the Egyptian history, because it's accepted even in biblical times that the Egypt's an ancient civilization, been around a long damn time. So there was no world cleansing flood, in the years in between. They had talked about it. It would have been, it would have been on their damn hieroglyphs on their damn the pyramids. They'd have talked about it. Although there's evidence, though, even in Egypt, specifically if you want to dance around the controversies with the Sphinx, that, yeah, there was a whole shitload of water that came down in a short period of time in a certain era of existence, all about 13,000 years ago. So if we leap before that just a hair, who's to say what human civilization was like and capable of pre-flood era, pre-downfall of Atlantis era? There's plenty of evidence worldwide that there's been, human civilization has existed far longer than what we previously thought. And they're still wrestling with it. There's still some groups that are trying to squash it, trying to argue that's that, whatever. At the end of the day, I think we don't know half of what we think we know, and a tenth of the stuff we do know, and there's so much more left to be figured out there that we just trying to calculate how much and how often and how long is impossible. So, possibility that some kind of European outfit came to North America to get their hands on excess copper. Then this, of course, creates some conundrums too. One being is that if you only have to look at more recent history of the Spaniards' invasion of Central America, or their exploration phase of Central America, to understand just how devastating that can be to a secular group of people that have been isolated for their entire existence. So when the Europeans have been quite exposed to everything the rest of the majority of the world had been exposed to at one point or another, i.e. plagues and illnesses and things like this, bring them to an entire virgin group of people who have no immunities whatsoever to any of this crap. It's not surprising. So almost overnight, in less than a generation, the entire Incan culture up and damn near disappeared. The Mayans up and damn near disappeared. And it wasn't because the handful of Spaniards went on a genocidal tirade. No, it's because the little funky things that we're immune to butchered and slaughtered a big huge chunk of that population almost overnight. And imagine what that would have looked like in history if that had been repeated under different circumstances. So the idea that the native population wouldn't have consumed that is kind of false too, because we're back to a number of different numbers or hypothesizes of how much copper has been mined in antiquity, but depending on whose numbers you go by, if you divide it by year, they estimate that they've been mining copper in and around the Great Lakes for 7,500 years. So if you just take that as a carte blanche number and you divide it, you either get about 50 pounds of copper a year or 5,000 pounds of copper a year, depending on whose numbers you go by, what they think in estimates of tonnage that came out of pre-modern era measuring and stuff of that nature. Well, that's a hell of a lot of shit. I mean, it's a hell of a lot. But if you look at it from a larger picture, if you got a community of, 500,000 people spread out across 4 or 5 states who all depend on that copper for all kinds of things, that's not unreasonable production for that volume of people. Not to mention that copper would have been exported as an item and copper items for sure, exported as a trade good for things that the locals want. They would export them out to the next tribe over who, pass them on down the road kind of thing. Then there's the possibility that there's evidence that if you go back early enough in American history, that some of these bigger Native American civilizations had actually had ties and expansions into North America proper. So to say that the Incans or the Mayans, for example, didn't have outposts as far as the Great Lakes is maybe just generous. At best, they're just stupid. At worst, of course, then there's the hypothesis. The Minoans figured out how to get to the northwest shore or the northeast shores of Scandinavia or Nova Scotia and stuff, and from there from Upper New York, and from there the Native Americans brought all this copper over from the Great Lakes and traded them. Well, there's no evidence of that either. And at absolutely no point in any of the Native American lore do they talk about having that sort of an encounter with people. So the opposite side of that would be the Minoans bringing their people too. Now, there's some credence to this, and it's the same thing when we have evidence that the Templars and others, so Europeans have been in America, in the Americas, lots earlier than what we officially are comfortable agreeing to. And possibly even much further earlier than that, because we have evidence that the Vikings, of course, managed to get as far as Newfoundland and Greenland and up into the northeastern corners of Nova Scotia and things like this. And we have evidence from the other direction, the Pacific Islanders, like in the using the big rafts and stuff to make it to South America from vast distance of water. And then so the possibilities is pretty grand. But if you look at the diversity, so there's certain American Indian tribes, for example, that are much more ethnically different or ethnically closer in line with Europeans than Asians from the South Pacific or the Pacific, or across the Mongolians from across the land bridge. So obviously some bloodstock did arrive in America from the European region somehow. Whether they were blown there by accident in a storm. Somebody told me once it can take 2 weeks. If you catch the right winds and the right current, you can go from England to Europe in a few weeks. From Europe to Americas in a few weeks, where it takes upwards of 6 weeks to 2 months to make that reverse trip, because you're fighting the current. The current's different, or you have to go much further south to catch the current that will help you out. So you're still going way out of your way, but it takes you 2 to 3 times longer to cross one way than it does the other way. This would be important. And so the odds of them, even if we go back to that the illness thing, if we go back and say that this so-called European copper mine trade network developed pre-flood, pre-Younger Dryas, then we're talking 14,000 years ago or older. A lot of the illnesses and diseases that the Europeans in the more modern era, 1200s, 1100s, 1300s, have been exposed to and survived themselves. Think of the bubonic plague, the black plague, the dozens of other things that literally cut up huge chunks of the population. So you have a lot less of that going on the older you go back. So the smaller populations play a role too. So it's less likely to have some kind of illness jump ship than it would be in more modern era, because the more stuff's occurred. It's just the way it kind of goes. It's the messiness of being human, and human evolution. So we look at all that, and I make the argument, I don't see that Europeans really have any solid proof in the modern era perspective of there having been a Minoan or Egyptian or any European trade whatsoever with North America, outside of the accident where the ship gets blown off course craft. Somebody gets blown off their ship and manages to survive barely, or the extreme efforts of the Vikings, who never made up. Even they acknowledged that it was just too far to the west to travel for so little at that point, so little to gain. So that they weren't looking for a new land to settle per se. They were looking for places to exploit and peoples to exploit. So they didn't end up with that. We have this different dynamic. Now, the possibilities, like I said, it's also saying that the Native Americans didn't use or couldn't have used the sheer amount of copper that they mined. Why not? I mean, honestly, why not? How many generations of these people did this? Meanwhile, how many of these items and tools did they make that broke and wore out and got thrown into their midden pits and lost in the jungle, or the woods, and when they're moving around, or they're, I'm just saying how durable were a lot of these tools and items. How often do they need to be replaced? In addition to that, there is ample evidence that these items, tools, and copper itself was traded to other tribes that were further away, often in exchange for the rock, like slate and flint and things that were hard to get locally, that weren't suitable for what they needed them to use. And these are fairly lightweight items, and when you talk the tools and stuff in small numbers, it'd be more than easy for it to be a real good item for trade. That said, I don't know that I've ever read anything about there being dedicated trading merchant networks amongst Native Americans. I know that trading went on between groups, and I just speculate that so this group encounters this group, they do some swapping and bartering, trading, and then they go their own way, and then eventually they bump into two other groups and do some, so that's how things move along the chain. But there's also indications that, especially some of these tribal organizations that were more settled down, that potentially they did have networks set up. Said, look, every 3 months we're going to send some guys down there with some ponies and some stuff, and we'll do a swap. And that would work that way on a local scale more than on a nationwide scale, without a doubt. That's one of the big limiting factors of having big, huge, powerful nation states in antiquity. Well, the population density was far, far less than it is now. So the truth was, you could literally go hundreds of miles and never see a soul, and with all the good and bad that goes with that. I don't think any Great Lake copper, circa, pre the current era, has ever been shipped over to Europe on purpose as trade. I'd like to believe it was. I think that if the only caveat I could make to that would be if it was from a pre-flood, civilization, because if you go by Plato's descriptions of Atlantis, for example, they were technologically advanced. In some aspects, more advanced than we are now, but in a lot of aspects, definitely more advanced than the locals of the time. And one of those was the ability to travel vast distances. And it's debated whether or not they actually had airships or they were talking just normal shipping. But generally, even if they had both, the main point is that they had a much better understanding of the world at large. We also have bits and pieces of evidence. When you look at the Perry map, for example, of these maps that were created to show features of regions of the Earth that we didn't officially was accepted as known information until more modern, the 20th century. So it just boggles the brain. And you add the possibility that obviously there were some sort of civilizations going on pre-Younger Dryas, which I like to attribute to Noah's flood, because they seem to be about right in the story, sync with the what we know of the historical facts. So whether it was an actual worldwide flood, I doubt that, but it was quite significant. And if you talk about anybody, like the Great Flood Wall that breaks up here in northwestern America, and the damage done to the ground is just on a biblical scale, right? The same thing would happen when the Red Sea or whatever the pass there opened up enough to flood, double the size of that ocean. And then we know that the Black Sea, because we know it did, because the actual coastline and stuff from antiquity is what, 20, 30, 50, 200 feet down, 50 feet down. So that was a hell of a lot of water in a short period of time, and it took out an entire section of, who knows how many civilizations, etc. It's always an interesting topic. I've always had a fascination with this sort of stuff, and I believe there's just enough evidence scattered about the Americas to reinforce the fact Europeans did come here much sooner than what we attribute to the exploration phases, and perhaps even much sooner that in antiquity. That we also acknowledge that the Native American tribes, specifically of the Northeast, very well established and pretty fairly advanced for what they wanted to be, sufficiently large enough numbers to, be a bit of a threat for anybody, if they want to make that deal. So the fact is that they have a demand for copper on a scale that would support that. Sure, I can absolutely see that the majority of the copper being mined out of the Great Lakes were utilized in and around the damn Great Lakes. How many tons and tons of copper got chucked into and lost and buried in the ground that people now would dig up as part of an archaeological sign. Well, for every one item like that, there's 5 other items that was just either handed down and wore out, or got lost on the trip to the woods, or from the woods, or up the river, etc., etc. Anyway, till next time, I'm Rick. You ain't. Just give it some thought, right? Just give it some thought. What if? What if?
It just irritates me to no end.